Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Marbus, and today I'm so honored to welcome Dr. Hana Kahleova. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for
Good.
having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm so excited to speak to you because you have the knowledge of some amazing, cool stuff that my audience is going to love. But first, I love to hear stories of why physicians became doctors. And can you give us a little information about maybe a plant-based diet and how you became a doctor?
Absolutely. When I was 14 years old, it really struck me how people were becoming more and more sick. Like the generation of my parents was suffering from heart disease and cancer and just so many health problems. And I started asking myself, well, is there anything that I can do to prevent those diseases from developing? Like for example, smoking is a good example. If I don't smoke, if I never start smoking, how much can I influence my health? And these questions led me to exploring all the options in the lifestyle. And I came to the conclusion that a plant-based diet is one of the best ways how to prevent the chronic disease. And so I became vegan when I was 14 years old. My parents were not very happy with that decision, and they were really concerned. However, they stopped trying to persuade me, and then my mom told me eventually, well, fine, do your vegan diet, but you need to cook for yourself. And she was thinking, that would be the end of it. I was like, fine, okay, let's do it. And that started a wonderful journey. Of course, not all the recipes turned out perfectly in the beginning, like there were some disasters in the beginning, but I learned from the mistakes, and that started really a wonderful journey. And once I started experiencing, although I was fully healthy, I still was able to tell the difference between the high fat, high meat, high cheese diet and a plant-based diet. I was able to tell the difference in the way how I felt, in my performance, in the clarity of mind. And so I decided to stick to it and also look for opportunities how to help other people realize these connections and how not to become sick in the first place, but if they are sick, then help them realize the connections and make the adjustments that are necessary in order for them to become well. And that's why I decided to become a doctor. And during my specialty training as an endocrinologist, my heart really went out to the patients with diabetes, because the official recommendations were just stating carb counting as the main strategy, and these people were mostly left up with meat and dairy, as their staple foods, basically. And this made me incredibly sad. And I decided to do something personally to help them. And so that started my journey in plant-based nutrition for people with diabetes. And I conducted several trials showing that a plant-based diet is twice as effective compared to the standard American Diabetes Association recommended diet. So it's really exciting to be able to be in a place to help people using plant-based nutrition, and also to look at the mechanisms behind. Why does it work more efficiently? How is it even possible that with all the carbs in the plant-based nutrition, we're able to improve diabetes? It's super exciting.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much right there. First of all, you were 14. I
Yes.
mean, when I was 14, I was like, where's my driver's license? I wasn't worried about lifestyle diseases and and all the things. So was there someone in particular that was ill, or I mean, you were just so perceptive as a
Uh,
child.
there was no one particularly ill.
Okay.
My grandma was a diabetic, like a mild diabetic, and
Mm,
died of breast cancer at the end
I see.
when she was fairly young, at the age of 63.
Wow.
And that made a huge impact on me because I really loved her
Yeah.
and I missed her a lot. So that was one of the impressions that like started my thinking about, what can we do to prevent disease and also to cure the disease when it's there.
Amazing. That is, I love stories of young people coming to
Mhm.
like wisdom and these amazing conclusions that, most people would travel hundreds of miles and go and visit someone, living in a cave as a monk or something, but you come to it just naturally. It's incredible. So let's get to the meat of it, well, so to speak. What is the actual, would you say, mechanism, or can you explain it for those who may not understand the mechanism of actually what causes, let's say, maybe describe type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and then why the plant-based diet is so phenomenal in helping these people?
Yeah, this is super exciting. So type 2 diabetes is caused by insulin resistance due to buildup of fat in the muscle and in the liver. Uh, our adipose tissue has only a certain capacity to store fat. So if we keep overeating, if we eat a high-fat diet, the fat still needs to be storing somewhere, but the adipose tissue has only a certain capacity, and once it's reached, then the fat starts spilling over to the muscle and liver cells and other organs in our body, and this leads to insulin resistance inside those cells.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the insulin that's produced to push glucose inside the cells is not able to open the door for glucose and let the glucose in uh, as efficiently as it used to. And it's because of the buildup of fat inside the muscle and liver cells, particularly.
Yeah.
So it's not the extra sugar in the diet. It's mainly the extra fat in the diet that is the culprit of developing diabetes. And if we want to solve the problem, then the problem would be to get rid of the extra fat in the muscle and liver cells. And the most efficient way is to cut down on the fat in our diet. And a plant-based diet is an excellent example how we can achieve it. Because if we still include some dairy and meat, even if they're low fat, the percentage of fat that we're consuming is fairly high. It's
Mm-hmm.
much more than on a plant-based diet. So if we cut down all the dairy and all the meat and all the eggs, and if we limit the oil consumption and are reasonable with nut and seed consumption, then the percentage of fat in our diet may be about 10 to 15% of total energy, which is a low-fat diet, but it doesn't really feel like it. You will be able to still enjoy, plenty of flavor in the plant-based nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the most natural ways how to cut down on fat
Right.
and promote dissipating of fat in the muscle and liver cells that's causing the insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes.
So it's naturally going to be a lower fat diet, a
Right.
whole food plant-based diet, which will lead to a decrease in the intramyocellular lipid,
Right.
basically, though it's going in the muscle. And you're clearing out those little doors, and the insulin works, and the glucose goes in, and things get better. And this happens really, really quickly. At least that's in my experience with
Yeah.
patients. Tell me, can you share any stories of like amazing rapid recoveries? I mean, it's amazing.
Usually we see changes within a few days where we need to reduce the medications for people with diabetes so that they don't get hypoglycemic. So it's really amazing. To give you another analogy why plant-based diet work, um, it's like when you have a chimney and a fireplace at home, and you want to have a nice fire and enjoy the warmth of the fire. But somehow you get this smoke whenever you light up the fire. And you're like, what is it? There's so much smoke. And one of the solutions how not to get the smoke is not to make the fire,
Right.
or keep the fire super low. That would be an analogy to keeping your carbs very low in your diet. But in the first place, you got the fireplace to enjoy the fire and the warmth of the fire. So a much better way is to clean the chimney and the fireplace, and then you will be able to burn as much wood as you want and enjoy the fire without the smoke. So that's exactly what happens with a plant-based diet. Once we clear the chimney and the fireplace, once we clean the cells from the extra fat that's stored inside the muscle and liver cells, we are able to burn as many carbohydrates as we need to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fairly usual that people, when they switch to a plant-based diet, might start consuming like 3 times more carbohydrates than they used to. But their blood sugar is low. In fact, it's so low that we can reduce their medications, and sometimes we can, get them off their medications completely. Sometimes they still need to stay on some meds. It really depends. There's no guarantee in life. But anyway, everyone benefits from a plant-based diet. We haven't seen one single person who would not benefit from a plant-based diet.
Exactly. Exactly. So there's so much in just a few phrases that you said. So I used to describe that as the glucose or the high blood sugars is the smoke, but I didn't ever put the analogy of the fire. That's really good. But I said it's the smoke from the fire,
Right.
and our medicines are just trying to waft the fire and keep it down.
Yeah.
But if we put out the gasoline that's fueling the fire, which is removing the high fat, it's exactly it. And that was one of my challenges as a physician, was learning how to, 8 years ago, there wasn't really where for me to go and say, when I switched to a plant-based diet myself, like, how do I work with patients? And it was a trial and error. It was almost frightening, because you have to cut, at least for me, a lot of my patients, I'm cutting insulin in half the first day that they're 100%. And it's pretty dramatic. They feel great. So have you noticed that, blood sugars will go up even with certain nut consumption? Like you said, reasonable nut consumption, like avocados as well. What would you consider a reasonable amount for majority of people?
So we advise people that they may only use, for example, 1 tablespoon to sprinkle their oatmeal, because in the initial stages, particularly when you need to lose so much weight, and when you need to get rid of all the extra fat in your muscle and liver cells, the more you're able to cut down on the fats in your diet, the better. So you don't really need much.
Gotcha.
You can still use almond milk, because the fat content is super low. It's watered down. So it's not that you cannot consume anything from nuts and seeds, but we just limit the super concentrated foods, and particularly oils. We teach people how to use vegetable broth and soy sauce, or just water, to saute their onions, and we teach them how to prepare their food without using oils.
Absolutely. And that can be done with any recipe that I've used.
Yeah.
Oil you can find a replacement for, regardless, even baked goods. Not that we should be eating a lot of baked goods, but still. So then when you talk about, your research is in a variety of things, especially metabolic health and diabetes. Can you talk a little bit about like meal frequency and timing and diabetes, or just in weight, controlling weight in general? Because a lot of that is all tied up together.
So many people still think that in order to maintain their body weight, or in order to lose weight, they need to have a lot of small meals during the day. We conducted a trial several years ago in patients with type 2 diabetes, comparing the common advice of 6 small meals during the day with only 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch. So the caloric intake was the same, but on one regimen, it was just separated out into 6 small meals. And on the other one, it was a large breakfast and large lunch. And that was it for the day. The patients were quite concerned in the beginning if they could even do the 2-meal diet plan. So I assured them that's up to me to teach them all the details, and all we were asking was the willingness to give it a try. And so we started with a 1-week tutorial for both of the regimens, because it sounds like an easy task to do 6 small meals during the day, but it's not as easy as many might think. You know, I did it with my patients myself, and I was hungry most of the day, because in order to have 6 small meals during the day, the meals really need to be small.
Right, right.
So, you know, your breakfast is pretty small. Then you get to eat something in a few hours. But in the meantime, I was starving. And that's how most of my patients were feeling as well. You know, at the end of the trial, it was a crossover trial, which means that all the participants tried both 6 meals a day and 2 meals a day in a random order. Some of them started with 2 meals a day, and then after 12 weeks, they switched over to 6 meals. The other group started with 6 meals and then switched over to 2 meals.
Okay.
And at the end of the trial, we found out that people were losing more weight on 2 meals a day. Their metabolism improved more on 2 meals a day. And what was most striking probably was that hunger was reduced more on 2 meals a day. So people were feeling more full on 2 meals a day, which was like a super surprising finding for most of our patients. And in fact, most of our patients decided to stick to the 2 meals a day at the end of the trial.
Oh, wow.
Because they found out that it's really working for them metabolically. Their diabetes is getting better, they're losing weight, and they're also feeling better. So why in the world would you stick to 6 meals a day when you can try 2 meals a day? For some people, it may feel like 2 meals a day is too strict. And some people may decide to still keep their dinner. But to those, I would like to say, keep your dinner light, you know, keep it like as a big salad. It shouldn't be anything heavy. It shouldn't be French fries, you know, it shouldn't be anything that's super heavy before you go to sleep. So if you're hungry in the evening, if you feel like you need to eat something, you can eat a piece of fruit and a little bit of popcorn maybe, or just a bowl of salad. Keep your dinner super light so that you're hungry in the morning, because it's the breakfast that jumpstarts our metabolism. At my postdoctoral fellowship at Loma Linda University, I was studying the data from more than 50,000 people that were followed for more than 7 years. And we were looking at their dietary habits, at how many meals a day they were eating if they were consuming breakfast, and at the timing of the meals. And we were tracking the changes in their body mass index, if they were prone to losing weight or gaining weight, or if their weight was stable. And what we found out was quite striking. We found a linear relationship between the number of meals and changes in body weight. So the more meals people were eating, the more they were likely to gain weight. When we had 3 meals a day as a reference, then snacking, that means eating 4 or even more meals a day, was really increasing the chances of gaining weight. But people who were eating 2 meals a day were even better off than those eating 3 meals a day. There's a small group of Seventh-day Adventists that consume 2 meals a day as a traditional way of eating, which comes, you know, it's really an ancient habit. It's not as modern as we might think. It really comes back to several centuries and maybe even several thousand years back. So when people are consuming less frequently, when they're eating only 2 to 3 meals per day, they are better off in terms of weight management compared to those who like to snack. And breakfast was clearly the most protective meal of the day. People who made their breakfast the largest meal of the day were the best off compared with those who were eating lunch or even dinner, the largest meal of the day. And also the length of night fast mattered. The longer the night fast, the better. So when people were on 2 meals a day and their night fast was about 18 hours, that means the meals were some 5 to 6 hours apart. That showed the most beneficial results.
So when you did your research with the crossover study, the first one you mentioned, was this a plant-based diet as well?
It was very much plant-based in order to get all the fiber. They didn't have to become vegan, though. It was not a requirement for the study. We gave them plenty of recipes with, that were plant-based, but it was not a requirement to skip the meat and dairy completely.
Okay. And then with the Seventh-day Adventist, so you're saying that the breakfast is the most important meal as far as being protective in the mechanisms of weight gain and metabolic health. Is there a reason why, or is there an understanding of why that occurs?
Yeah, that's a fascinating area of research. The chronobiology and our circadian rhythms are super exciting area of research. So, for example, shift workers have a higher risk of developing obesity and type 2 diabetes, even though their caloric intake might be the same as in people who work day shifts. And that's one of the reasons that shift work disrupts the circadian rhythms. And we do the same if we eat late at night, for example. We do the same. We disrupt our circadian rhythms. That's why we tend to gain more weight. For example, one study compared the same meal eaten at breakfast, lunch, and dinner and looked at how many calories we store in the form of fat. And even though it was the same meal, after dinner, people were storing much more fat compared with the same meal eaten at breakfast or at lunch. Wow. So there's definitely the hormonal changes throughout the day make a big difference. And this is just how we are wired to start our day with breakfast. Tell our body, now is the day, now you need to eat. And after sunset, traditionally, people were not in such a position to eat so much food as we are now. They didn't have electricity. They just went to bed and were rising early, right? So that's like a traditional way of living, and we're coming kind of back there, and we are learning how to live more wisely, even with the resources that we have today.
So eating breakfast and lunch, breakfast being the larger meal, 2 meals a day, helps with weight management. What about blood sugars? Is there any studies as far as blood sugars improving by eating the meals in the morning, larger meals and such as well? I mean, is there significant change, even if it's the same meal?
Yeah, that's a fascinating study done by Daniela Jakubovic from Israel. She did quite a few studies in people with diabetes, looking at the difference between eating breakfast and skipping breakfast, and the effect on glycemic control throughout the whole day. And she found out that after skipping breakfast, the whole glycemic control is impaired during the whole day. The blood sugar is about 20 to 30% higher after skipping breakfast, which is like contra-intuitive, right? You would expect the the glucose, the blood sugar to be lower when you skip breakfast, when you don't eat. But it's the opposite. When you measure 24-hour glucose control in people with diabetes, it's significantly impaired when you skip breakfast. And it's due to impaired insulin signaling, impaired insulin secretion, and also impaired incretin secretion. Incretins are hormones that are secreted in our gut when we ingest a meal, and they promote insulin secretion. And patients with diabetes have a diminished incretin effect, so they are able to secrete less incretins. So for them particularly, it's important to use all the tools we can to boost their incretin secretion. And definitely eating breakfast is one of the tools that can increase the incretin secretion. And another one is a plant-based diet. We did a study comparing a veggie burger with the same amount of energy and macronutrient content from a meat-based burger. And we were studying the incretin effect in patients with diabetes. And we found out that after the veggie burger, the incretin secretion was about 30% higher than after the meat-based burger. And that's an effect seen in medications that were specifically developed for this condition. So it's pretty impressive, you know, when you combine these simple tools, plant-based diet and eating breakfast as your largest meal. You can really compensate for the deficit caused by diabetes. You might be even able to get rid of your diabetes completely.
Absolutely. So now we're going to talk about gut health, but I want to ask one other question. You mentioned, okay, so it's breakfast and largest meal, then lunch, having, 16, 18 hours of fasting overnight with 6 hours or so between your meals.
Right.
So that's a big breakfast and lunch, I will say. Now, for these are people who don't necessarily, let's say they don't, need to lose weight. So we want to be careful and make sure they're eating enough to maintain a proper weight. But are there any particular foods that we should be focusing on outside of removing, a lot of high fat foods like oils and avocados and nuts that help more than others as far as controlling blood sugars, like vegetables, beans? Is there any particular area we should focus on when we are eating these two very important meals in the day?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know about food processing as one of the major factors that can cause fluctuations in blood sugar. So if you eat a lot of white bread, your blood sugar may still spike even if you skip all the dairy and meat. So it's definitely a good thing to go back to the garden, back to the produce that you can get in as a natural state as possible, to eat your grains as whole grains like brown rice and millet and quinoa. These are great sources of carbohydrate that also contain a lot of fiber, and this will lead to stable blood sugars instead of the spikes after sugar. Even sugar sweetened beverages, those should be completely avoided. And more processed foods like white bread or white rice. So it's good to really focus on having whole grain instead of processed grains.
So avoiding any processed foods. So is there any particular foods in the whole food plant-based diet that might be more beneficial than others?
It seems like leafy greens and beans provide the most benefits to people with diabetes and stabilize their blood sugar the most. But all plant foods are wonderful, and it's about combination. Sometimes when people are not used to eating as many beans and they get gas, it might take a while, but if they keep consuming small amounts of beans every day, their gut microbiome will start adapting, and they will develop the healthy gut bacteria that they will able to get rid of their gas.
Which is an excellent segue to let's talking about gut microbiome, which I know you enjoy to speak about as well. Can you talk us a little bit about why the gut microbiome? Well, let's explain what it is for those who may be living under a rock and don't know by now what it is, but what importance it is as far as metabolic health, diabetes, weight management.
So gut microbiome is the bacteria that live in your gut. And we have more bacteria in our gut than we have cells in our body. So we want to take care of the gut bacteria that live there. It's interesting to look at the differences between different populations in the world. For example, people living in Africa or South America have a larger diversity of their gut microbiome compared to Western countries. A larger diversity means more kinds of bacteria. You can think about it as of your financial portfolio. The more diversified it is, the better. You don't want to have only one kind of bacteria and then some disaster comes and the bacteria gets killed and you are in a big trouble. You want to have a nice portfolio so that when a crisis hits, you can rely on at least, the other ones that are still remaining. Absolutely. So with gut bacteria, it's the same. You want to have a large diversity in your gut microbiome of the gut bacteria. And it seems that plant-based eating, people living in Africa and South America, the traditional diets are very much plant-based, and animal foods are very rare because they are for the wealthy. So the diets are very much plant-based. And the diversity of their gut microbiome is much more pronounced than in the Western countries. But it's not only about plant-based diets themselves, it's also about the whole way of living. For example, in Africa, you will grow your own food and you are in more contact with nature, with the soil. You consume some of the bacteria. Whereas in Western countries, we are so obsessed with sanitation that we kill all the bacteria that we can. We are super careful about not consuming any microscopic amounts of dirt. So we get rid of all the bacteria that people, traditionally consume in other parts of the world. Because if you wash veggies only in water and with your hand, there will be some microscopic dirt and bacteria living in the soil, which you will consume, which will diversify your portfolio. So it's not only about eating plant-based foods, it's also about how you grow the foods, how you eat them. So if you visit your grandma and pick an apple from the tree, you can just eat the apple from the tree. The bacteria will not harm you from the garden. They're healthy for you.
Absolutely. And there's less inflammatory bowel disease and those type of things in those countries as well, like Uganda and such. So what does the diversity of our portfolio have to do with metabolic health as far as, our weight management and with diabetes? What's the research say there?
So there's a nice connection between the gut microbiome composition and metabolic health. Some bacteria are much more important than others, particularly the bacteria that feed on fiber, that produce short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, for example, are the most important ones. A good example is acute bacteria that's called Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. It's a difficult name, but it's a really cool bacteria. Faecalibacterium prausnitzii is very protective. It's one of the butyrate producing bacteria, so it's very good for your metabolic health. And it's been found that patients with diabetes have lower counts of this acute bacteria.
Hmm.
And the lower counts of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii in diabetes also correlates with insulin resistance and with inflammation. And markers of inflammation such as CRP, C-reactive peptide protein. So it seems that this bacteria plays an important role, and if we don't consume enough fiber, then we may suffer the consequences in the form of metabolic disease.
Mm.
To put this to a test, we put people on a plant-based diet, and we're looking at this bacteria, this Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, and we found out that the counts of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii really increased on a plant-based diet. And the increase correlated with changes in insulin sensitivity and changes in their body weight. So it's definitely the changes in your gut microbiome are so much connected to your metabolic outcomes. We are just not aware of the connections, but they're happening.
Wow.
There's secret communication.
I love that. There's so much, and also with mood and the gut microbiome, and it's really interesting. Food allergies and working with people. I work a lot with people with SIBO, and those people improve when you move them into gradually. It is a fascinating thing. I love talking about gut bacteria. There's so many things, and I know we're pushing on time, but I really want to talk to you also about when I watched you speak at the Plantrition Project conference last year. You were talking about beta cell regeneration, which, can you explain, first of all, maybe some people don't understand what beta cells are, and then what that would mean as far as the future for maybe those with type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Absolutely. Beta cells are insulin producing cells in our pancreas, and that's the only place where we can produce insulin. By the time type 2 diabetes is diagnosed, about 50% of the beta cells are gone. They're dead. And we're only trying to maintain what's remaining. And the current options are not very satisfactory. In spite of all the fancy medications, it seems that the numbers of beta cells are constantly declining after the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So eventually, you are losing even more of your beta cells, which means that you are relying on external insulin that you need to inject. And this is super unfortunate, and that led us to a question: is there anything we can do to prevent this decline? So let's say if you are overweight, your beta cell function is already compromised. You are not producing as much insulin as a healthy person. So we took people who were overweight and at a higher risk of diabetes, and we were measuring their ability to secrete insulin after a standard meal in 5 time points: 0, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 120, and 180 minutes. So 3 hours after the meal, we were measuring their blood glucose, but also their insulin secretion. And we were able to quantify their beta cell function. And a fascinating thing happened. After 16 weeks on a plant-based diet, their beta cell function not only remained the same, but it improved. Which means that we were able to wake up some of the beta cells that were already in the process of dying off, but we were able to still save them, and we were able to increase the insulin secretion based on the plasma glucose levels, which was super encouraging for everyone who doesn't want to develop diabetes in the first place. And in the second place, also for people with diabetes, because there's always some beta cells that are not producing insulin, but they're not completely dead yet, and there's a potential that we can still save them.
So it's like reviving beta cells that are in the ICU is kind of what I told patients.
Exactly.
And so do you think that's because we're now removing the fat that was maybe stored in the beta cells, or is there some other mechanism that's been theorized or known?
Yeah, removing the fat seems to be one of the most important mechanisms behind
Mm,
improving the beta cell function, because the fat stored inside the cells is the most disruptive
mm,
thing that can happen to the cell.
makes
So if
sense.
we are able to get rid of that, you know,
Absolutely.
the metabolic benefits are following.
So when we compare, so the type 2 diabetes is basically due to lifestyle, high fat diet.
Right.
Now, if we move to type 1 or even type 1.5, which are an interesting class of diabetics to work
Yes.
with, can you talk to us a little bit about, first of all, just explain maybe what type 1 is and being autoimmune disease, and then what type of research or budding research does there look like that possibly, beta cell regeneration in those individuals?
Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where the immune system uh, dis- disrupts all the beta cells and
Mm,
kills them, basically. So
mm,
these people need to rely on their external insulin, on their insulin injections. And now the question is there anything we can do for them using a plant-based diet? There are a few case studies showing significant improvements in insulin sensitivity after switching to a plant-based diet. So in spite of consuming much more carbohydrate, these people become so insulin sensitive that, for example, they triple their carbohydrate intake, but they're still able to reduce their insulin dose by half,
mhm,
which is amazing. They're not able to completely get rid of their insulin, but even if they reduce their insulin requirements, that's huge
mhm.
in terms of not only their health, but also in terms of um, the costs, saving significant amounts of money
Mhm.
with the prices of insulin. And also, a plant-based diet will improve their cardiometabolic outcomes as well, their blood lipids and their blood pressure. At the end, it's not the high blood sugar that's the killer in diabetes, or killer number one in diabetes. It's mainly the high blood lipids and other cardiometabolic risk factors. So
Mhm.
it's the cardiovascular disease that's the
Mhm.
killer. So a plant-based diet will reduce all these cardiometabolic risk factors,
Mhm.
and that's probably the most important finding.
Yeah, I would say my experience with type 1 diabetics is that they do a much lower insulin need, even though they're
Right,
eating a lot more
right.
carbohydrates. But I mean, this would go back to insulin sensitivity in your muscle and liver
Yeah,
cells, right? Because you're removing the fat component.
absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm. Is there any research on potential pancreatic like beta cell, like rebirth or any type of transplants? What is there any hope on the horizon for type 1 is actually finding a cure?
So the research on stem cells
Mm,
seems promising. There's a lot of ethical controversy and ethical issues
sure.
around stem cells.
Right.
Um, but if we are able to make the stem cells produce insulin, make them become beta cells that would be fully functional,
Mm-hmm.
that might be a new cure for type 1 diabetes.
Mm.
The research is still on the way, but it seems like it's a promising area of research as well.
So has there ever been any research, and this is just my brain thinking about mechanisms of antibodies attacking cells and then bringing in the killer cells and such, like a vaccine of some sort to attach to antibodies to
Mhm.
prevent the further autoimmune, complications, like for someone
Right,
maybe a type 1.5 who has these autoimmune mechanisms
right.
occurring, but that's a much longer process than the acute onset of type 1. Typically, that's been my experience. Is there anything like that in the works, or is that a crazy thought?
Yeah, there's plenty of studies that are currently underway that, try to manipulate the immune system and the production of antibodies. The success is fairly limited, unfortunately. There's severe side effects of these medications, and it's been not as successful as we would hope for.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that we will not be able to discover something in the near future, but
Absolutely.
we have not been successful so far.
Could you explain to us what the type 1.5s, what these are? I mean, because even a lot of primary care doctors are not familiar with what that is. I was sent a lot of these patients by the Mastering Diabetes folks. I was taking care of them. But is there a way for someone to be aware of maybe they have type 2 diabetes, it's not controlled, or what are the signs and symptoms of maybe someone is more autoimmune versus a type 2?
Right. So diabetology is one of the few areas where you can change the diagnosis, and if you if you find out that your previous diagnosis was not right. So for example, someone may be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but you discover that they're not really doing well on these oral medications, and that their blood sugar is still really high, and they're just not responding to the medications that you give them. Then the next step would be to measure their insulin production, because you may discover that not much insulin is left, and then you are in a scenario where you may be wondering, well, it's an adult person, but they're not producing any insulin. So is it type 1, or the insulin production is very low? So is it type 1? Is it type 2 at the final stages where the insulin production is low as well? So there's times when you are uncertain about the diagnosis. So that's why we're talking about diabetes 1.5, because of the ambivalent findings that we have.
So when you say measuring the insulin production, are you talking about C-peptide, levels?
Yes.
Okay. So when we get to the C-peptide, so a curious question. So let's say someone's already on insulin. Can you measure C-peptide? Is that still worthy of measuring? I mean, will it still be a good, even though their body's not maybe making less insulin because they're already taking external exogenous insulin? So it's still a good test to test?
Yeah, it still measures the
intrinsic make.
Exactly.
So it wouldn't be artificially low if they're already taking insulin external?
No.
Oh, perfect.
It's still a good marker.
Excellent. And then what would you be considered a low? So let's say someone gets a C-peptide and they're like, maybe they're a patient and they're like, maybe I'm going to ask my doctor about this to test what level would be considered a concerning level. And would you do a fasting C-peptide level, or would you do something else?
A fasting C-peptide is one of the best measures for, as a quick test. If we are not completely sure, we can also do an OGTT and do another one after 2 hours after the OGTT. The labs differ a little bit between the values and the cutoff points, and the diagnosis is really done by an endocrinologist. So it's better to always work with a professional and consult the findings with them.
Absolutely. So then it's just something to be aware of. So if, let's say we have a diabetic, they've went to a whole food plant-based diet, but they're still requiring, blood sugars aren't as well. So it just might be an indication to get further testing by an endocrinologist who can help them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Awesome. So as far as, we have 7 minutes left. I'm going to squeeze every little bit of information out of you. So as far as what your recommendation is for the healthy whole food plant-based diet, what would you say someone should be eating on a regular basis? Timing, is it 6 a.m., 8 a.m.? Get down to the nitty-gritty detail of what that would be.
An ideal meal plan for a day would be only 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch. the earlier we start eating breakfast and the earlier we finish our meals, the better. So a breakfast eaten somewhere between 6 and 8 a.m. would be ideal. Some good portion of oatmeal and fruit and nuts and seeds. You know, eat as much to get full, and then lunch eaten around 1 p.m. or so, with grains, legumes, so maybe some beans and rice and vegetables. That would be another healthy meal. And these two meals would provide enough energy for the rest of the day. So if you are sedentary, that's more energy than you need anyway.
Right.
If you are an athlete and if you struggle to get in as many calories as you can, then it's probably not the best way how to eat. But for those of us who are sedentary and do sports, but more like, an hour a day or so,
Right.
2 meals a day are completely sufficient.
Wow. So do you think, just getting to the exercise, should exercise be done before you eat, or is it okay to do it after you eat? Would you get benefit either way?
You get benefits either way. It depends on what you want to improve. So for example, for people with type 2 diabetes, whose goal is to get their blood sugar under control after the meal, a short walk after each meal is more beneficial to bring their blood sugar down. But for a person who wants to boost their metabolism, exercising before breakfast is the most beneficial, because you train your body to be able to survive on and metabolizing fat before you eat carbohydrates. So it depends on what benefits you're looking for. Generally speaking, most people would benefit from boosting their metabolism. So exercising in the morning before eating breakfast would be the most beneficial. However, exercise is good any time of the day. If all you can do is walk around the block after each meal, then it's a good starting point, and you should definitely do that.
Perfect. I think that is fantastic. And there's so many more things I could ask, but I understand you have time and I want to respect that. So thank you so much for joining us. And we so appreciate your expertise and sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.